The next session is our Innovation Spotlight, which will feature Alex Rainey, CEO and co-founder of Pluto, and Jill Menz, news editor at Phocuswright. And the Spotlight will feature an early stage travel company who's poised to disrupt the industry, not just through its technology, but also by leading change. So we're pleased to have Alex Rainey with us today to share his business as well as his pledge with the Phocuswright Europe audience. So Jill, Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. And thank you so much, Alex, for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So, let's just jump right in. Can you talk a bit about Pluto and, when you were founded? Give us a little background on the business.
Yeah, sure. So my kind of personal background is I worked at Accenture Digital for about 7 years, and Harry, my co-founder, worked at Fjord, which is a digital and strategy agency, and he worked at a couple of different other agencies as well. So our specialty is really in digital product and brand building. So not necessarily in finance, and we don't come from the travel industry. But if we wind the clocks back, we were really inspired by companies like Monzo, WeTransfer, just building really interesting companies with great design and tech at the heart, but not in traditionally interesting areas. So like banking and file transfers, respectively, never were particularly interesting until some of these guys arrived. So our first idea actually was an insurance chatbot we built and launched a while back, a couple of years before. And we learned very quickly that young people don't really care about insurance. So we took a bit of a, yeah, it's true.
Yeah, true.
We took a bit of a step back at that point and we said, what is it that we really want to focus on? What is it that we are more passionate about as well, personally? And the passion for us is really around travel and loving and building digital products. But there was still a clear opportunity in travel insurance. But we also knew more broadly that travel, it isn't without its stress and hassle. So in early 2018, we came up with a proposition for Pluto, and that was really focused on removing the hassle from travel by building a collection of tools to help travelers to discover, organize, and protect their trips. And we decided to focus on travel insurance as our first product, simply because there really aren't any other startups that are playing in that space. We said very clearly from day one that the strategy was always going to be more broadly about travel and really thinking about each of those different parts of the travel journey, and not just about one single bit.
Right. So it sounds like you got sort of a number of pain points that you're trying to address throughout the journey. What would you say the biggest pain points are that you are trying to address, and why is your technology in particular the solution for this?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, taking a step back from the problem, we know that travel for most people is one of the most important things in the world for them, and ranks above buying a house, saving money in general, better salary. There's all these different surveys out there, which is super interesting. And especially for a younger audience, this even goes, travel is even more important than, for instance, other generations. But when we start to really dig into planning a holiday and preparing for a holiday, we realize that people find that it takes longer and is more stressful than it should be. And that's simply because of the mishmash of tools, the kind of plethora and spectrum of different companies operating in the space, and the sheer amount of information which just kind of over-consumes and overwhelms people a lot of the time. So again, Pluto really exists to remove this hassle and to make it easy to do the discovery of trips, so that kind of information overload problem, the organization, so trying to bring together what is a bunch of different tools and companies at the moment into a single place, and then also protect their trip. Again, we know that insurance is one of those really dated areas where there aren't any new companies operating, or at least in some of the other spaces, there are some interesting companies, other interesting brands there. So whether that's tabs on your flight, creating a plan for your new trip, or just getting some help when something goes wrong, this is really where Pluto aims to step in. And we know that these problems can only really be solved by building incredible products, right? And these need to be built on the latest web and mobile technologies and platforms, but also the design and the brand, we feel is as important as the technology. We really do stress this in everything we do as a business, and the kind of things that we focus on. People's expectations are so incredibly high now when it comes to using a new technology or a new experience or a new brand. They're used to interacting with brands like Airbnb, Monzo in the UK, MailChimp, WeTransfer. There's a couple of our favorite businesses. So for us, if we think about the technology that we're using, a great outcome for us is that the product It's smooth, it's elegant, and most importantly, it's simple. But the customer doesn't seem to care or need to care about the technology and the complexity that really underpins that experience. To them, it's just a kind of simple, elegant one.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, everyone in travel has sort of had to adapt to this new environment we're in because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm curious, how has Pluto adapted any of its product offerings to sort of meet the moment that you and your company and the industry finds itself in?
Yeah, so coronavirus, definitely one of those big expected things that no startup would probably ever be prepared for, especially in the travel industry,
yeah.
Which I'm sure many of the listeners to this will be feeling the pain of themselves in different ways. We got two kind of core parts of the business at the moment. We have our travel insurance product that's been live for about a year and a half, and we're just about to launch our travel planning product. For the travel insurance product, we've tried very hard to adapt this to the current times, though we'll be honest, it's challenging, right? Because we want to cover the travel disruption caused by coronavirus much, much more than we're able to. And that's just a limitation of insurance. The very nature of it is it can't really cover you for things and protect you for things that are known about. It's best for the things that aren't known, the unknown. So we are trying to change our policies where we can and keep it up to date and help protect people as much as we can. For instance, we can cover people if they get coronavirus abroad, if they do still travel. But again, the very nature is at the moment, people are just not going abroad. And if they're not going abroad, then they're not buying travel insurance. And they don't buy travel insurance for domestic trips or for really short trips. So it is a product that is a little bit more difficult to adapt. Fortunately, we were working on our travel planning tool, Pinboard, before coronavirus. I think the last couple of months we've been able to focus almost exclusively on just building and focusing on, creating the best experience possible for Pinboard. And that's just allowed us to massively accelerate the product development in that space. And I think the interesting thing for us about Pinboard is that when we think about some of the travel trends that are starting to come up now, where we see domestic travel much, much higher, certainly in the UK and in other countries as well, much, much more popular. Rural holidays, again, becoming much, much more popular than, your classic city break. In Europe, for instance, when we think about UK travelers, this is something that Pinboard could facilitate beforehand for sure. But we're paying very, very close attention to what our customers are saying to make sure that the product that we're now building and launching in the next couple of weeks is going to be just as suitable in the midst of coronavirus, where these different travel habits are taking shape, and when things start to return to normal, people get back on planes and start to do long-haul trips and do much more international travel.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, another way that Pluto is sort of meeting the current moment we're in is you have designed this pledge around anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion. And we did write a bit about it on Phocuswright, but for the attendees here today, can you talk a bit about that pledge and what you hope to accomplish with it?
Yeah, sure. So, it all really started, and I think the unfortunate thing about the entire pledge is where it started. It started from reading the news of these tragic events in the USA, namely the murder of George Floyd. And this is a terrible reason for us to have to start any initiative, and it shows how far behind and how educated we are on the topic of racism in general, specifically systemic and institutional racism. Globally, in the USA, in the UK, but a lot within our own industries, travel and technology as well. So we very quickly realized that as a business, we were doing very little to ensure that we were building a diverse and inclusive business, but more importantly, an anti-racist business. So at this point, we did a deep dive into our business. We really tore the whole thing down. We understood, we went into rather how we operate, how we build products, how we launch products, how we communicate with our customers, with our investors, how we pick the partners that we want to work with. And we came up with a really long list of actions, some in the short term, some in the medium, some very long term, and some that we just hope to be kind of ongoing principles. And we ended up structuring this into our pledge of 10 actions. And I think the reason that we were so focused on structuring this as a pledge, as a document, rather than just an internal, almost backlog of actions, was that firstly, we hope that this could help set up Pluto with the right guidelines, processes, and values to help us build an anti-racist, diverse, and inclusive business. And as all startups would know, if it isn't being measured, if it's not being tracked properly as a kind of formal action for the team, for the management, then it's not something that's going to typically get done. And I think secondly, we realized, again, being a very small business and as an early stage startup, the bigger impact we might be able to have is if we can convince or even, influence or kickstart another startup's initiative, or get them thinking about this in a different way that they weren't already, then that might have a bigger impact than just our own actions. So we wanted to ensure that the actions were easy to consume in a way that was kind of quite actionable, I think, for other startups to read. Obviously publicizing it helps with our own transparency and accountability, but a big part of structuring the pledge in an easy to consume way, also that other startups could read it, other founders could read it, and maybe take something from that for themselves.
Great. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, the George Floyd thing kind of kickstarted this into gear, unfortunately. And, prior to sort of what's happening now, how did the startup community approach issues of anti-racism and diversity and inclusion? Did they much? And, beyond efforts like yours, what more needs to be done in the startup community?
Yeah, so, I guess we're only one small startup. We're very early on the journey. So, I do find it difficult to comment on the whole startup community more broadly, and we're certainly not in a position to be preaching or telling other people how to be doing things, because we're, right at the beginning ourselves. But I think, from what we can see, from looking at the numbers, from some of the early research that we did, whether you're looking at stats on attendees of industry conferences, managers, board members, diversity is clearly not a priority. And it's difficult to see that it is for big businesses when you look at the very raw numbers, even if there are initiatives that sit below that. From looking at the imagery used on major travel websites, on the social media, or even how they publicly responded to a lot of the recent events, you can again see diversity and anti-racism doesn't feel like a really strong priority for all of these businesses. For some it was, for a lot there might be some really good internal efforts going on behind the scenes, but again that's probably hard to see for a lot of consumers and for partners as well. So we've only really just started. We know relatively little at this point. We have so much to do, we know that, and we just need to acknowledge that we are part of the problem and have been historically, since we started a business, and probably ourselves as individuals as well. We're a small team of all white males. We spoke about that in your last piece online. So we have a lot to fix internally ourselves, certainly before asking other companies to do more themselves. But we really just hope that the next generation of travel and tech companies, who are the startups today and now, they start to take this as a priority early on. They talk about it openly. They're not afraid to be self-critical, acknowledge that they might be part of the problem, acknowledge any privilege that they have as founders, as individuals. And, they take now as starting to take action, because, it's never too late to start to take action.
Absolutely. So if we have a startup in the audience today thinking, of course, this is important, I want this to be a priority in my business, what are some of the first steps they can take? Can they look for your pledge? Is that a good starting point? How can these startups sort of start that step to start doing something?
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. And, this is exactly where we were 4 months ago. We were wondering, how do we start on what feels like a really big, broad, difficult to define topic, which you probably know very, very little about, or we certainly knew nothing about right when we started out. I think starting small, like with most things, is a very sensible place to start, because it is such a big and overwhelming topic. Starting to read a couple of articles online, see what other companies are doing if they publish something. Our pledge, if you're interested, it's at blog.pluto.travel. You can see all the information there, and you can read in further and how we kind of constructed that. And there's a lot more detail that sits behind just the pledge. Project Include is another great example, another great resource as a kind of starting point to understand, where you can start to take action as a business and start to pick things that are relevant to your company. Reaching out to other people, other founders that have worked or doing work in this space, or have made some advancements in this space. There'll be a huge amount that you can learn from them. There'll be some great advice that you can get from them as well. I think what we were quick to realize as well, that is, again, as a team of all white males, we're probably not the greatest starting point to be the place where action should necessarily come from, or to have a kind of unbiased view about what we should do as a business. So we quickly started working with a company called Hustle Crew. They're an incredible diversity consultancy. I couldn't recommend them enough for other startups out there, even bigger businesses, to get a membership there and support them. But they helped us to cultivate the pledge a little bit and gave us some advice and a bit of correction in some areas where we were maybe being naive, or not understanding things in the right way, or maybe where some of our actions could be doing more harm than good, for instance. So don't be afraid to get external help. and get a bit of support in that sense. And then I think most importantly is to get together with your teams, is to write it down, to make it public, and to create that first set of actions, even if it is small. These can be updated, these can change over time, these can grow, but simply by setting targets, again, as the audience of startups will know, setting targets, setting objectives, that's how things get done. It's how things get done in marketing and product and operations and businesses. This just needs to be another priority. So.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are coming up on time here, but thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's a great message for all the startups or any business in the audience. And so thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you, Jill.
Okay.